Today, we're going to walk through the facts of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in modern history. Our goal here is to really understand the events of the Fritzl case as they actually occurred, looking at the evidence that finally brought this incredibly dark story into the light. Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll start with a shocking discovery that blew the whole thing open. Then, we'll actually go back in time to see the 24 years of darkness Elizabeth Fritzl lived through. We'll look at the mind of her captor, this architect of deception, and then we'll finish up with the trial and what happened after. So let's start where the rest of the world did, at the very end of the story, with the one single event that made decades of carefully built lies come crashing down. I mean, that was the central question, right? It's almost unbelievable. And it's what the authorities in the small town of Amstetten, Austria, were trying to figure out back in April of 2008. The answer, as we now know, was more horrifying than anyone could have possibly imagined. You know, the craziest thing is, this whole case cracked open because of a medical emergency. It was Josef Fritzl himself who brought his captive granddaughter Kirsten to the hospital. He'd kept her hidden for her entire life, but she was so sick, it actually forced his hand. And what's just incredible is how fast it all unraveled. We're talking about a deception that lasted decades, and it crumbled in just 1 week. The doctors were baffled by Kirsten's condition, so they called the police. The police then put out a media appeal for Kirsten's missing mom, which totally cornered Fritzl. He had no choice but to let Elizabeth and her 2 sons out of the cellar. And then, at the hospital, Elizabeth made her demand, the one condition that changed everything. She would talk, but only if she was guaranteed she would never have to see her father again. All right, so to really understand this, we have to go back, way back to the beginning, August 1984. This is where it all started, in this hidden world built right under the family's feet. 24 years. Just let that sink in for a second. That's a huge chunk of a lifetime. For nearly a quarter of a century, Elizabeth was a prisoner of her own father, just a few meters beneath the very house where, for everybody else, life just went on as normal. And when you look at the diagram, you see just how complex this prison was. This was not some simple locked room in a basement. It was this elaborate, custom-built bunker. To even get to Elizabeth, you had to go through 8 different locked doors. And the last one, a 300-kilo steel door, reinforced with concrete, hidden behind shelves, and opened only by a secret electronic code that only he knew. This timeline, man, it just lays out the escalating horror of it all. Just 4 years after being imprisoned, Elizabeth gave birth to her first child. As the years went on, Fritzl actually expanded the prison, and more children were born into this nightmare. The death of the infant Michael without any medical help, that's just one of the darkest moments in this entire story. 55 square meters. So what does that even mean? Well, to put it in perspective, that's about the size of a small 2-room apartment. Imagine that, a cramped, windowless space for a mother and 3 children to live out their entire lives. So what Fritzl created down there was a world of absolute control, total dependence and terror. He controlled their light, their food, even their very air. He used deprivation as punishment and told them the whole place was rigged to kill them if they ever tried to escape. And yet, even in all that darkness, Elizabeth showed this incredible resilience, trying her best to give her children some kind of education with the few books and the TV he gave them. Which brings us to the big question, right? How on earth did no one notice this for 24 years? And that leads us to the elaborate and just chillingly effective deception that Josef Fritzl built for the outside world. Well, it's because his deception was it was masterful in its cruelty. He cooked up this perfect cover story. Elizabeth ran away to join a cult. And to sell that lie, he forced her to write letters, which she would then go and postmark from different towns. And then, in this incredibly brazen move, he starts bringing his own captive children upstairs one by one, claiming they were foundlings that Elizabeth had just left on his doorstep. And you know what? Social workers bought it. They found his story very plausible, and he passed every single check. Get this, there was a tenant living on the ground floor of the house for 12 years, and they heard noises from the basement. And when they asked Fritzl about it, his answer was just simple, confident. Oh, that's just the faulty pipes of the gas heating system. And that was enough. He was hiding this enormous secret in plain sight. Okay, so we've talked about what he did, but now we have to try and understand who this man was. To even begin to process these actions, we have to look at the psychological profile of the person who planned it all. So after he was arrested, a whole bunch of psychiatric evaluations were done to try and get inside his head. The goal wasn't to excuse what he did, obviously, but to understand the kind of pathology that could drive someone to do this. And what they found wasn't simple at all. His official diagnosis was a severe combined personality disorder. We're talking a mix of borderline, schizotypal, and schizoid traits. Essentially, it paints a picture of a deeply, deeply fractured personality. Someone who was emotionally unstable, detached from reality, and driven by this pathological need for absolute control and a complete lack of empathy. And when you look at his history, you see a clear pattern. This didn't come out of nowhere. He claimed he'd had an abusive childhood, and then he continued that cycle by imprisoning his own mother in the attic, even bricking up her window until she died. He also had a previous conviction for a violent rape back in 1967. And here's the crucial part. Because of Austrian law at the time, that criminal record was eventually wiped clean, which hid his violent past from the very social services that were supposed to be checking up on him. But maybe the most bone-chilling thing of all comes from Fritzl himself. In his psychiatric assessment, he reportedly said, "I was born to rape and I held myself back for a relatively long time." He saw himself as innately evil. This wasn't some sudden impulse. In his mind, it was his destiny. It just shows a terrifying level of self-awareness about his own depravity. And that brings us to the final part of this public story, the quest for justice in the courtroom, and then the long, long road to recovery for the family who survived this nightmare. The trial itself happened pretty fast. Now, at first, Fritzl pleaded not guilty to the murder charge for the death of the infant Michael. But then, his daughter, Elizabeth, appeared in court, and apparently, seeing her just caused him to completely break down. The very next day, he changed his plea to guilty on all charges. The sentence was life in prison. And what about the house, the scene of the crime? Well, in 2013, a really decisive step was taken. The cellar, that site of so much suffering, was completely filled with concrete. It was this powerful, symbolic act to make sure that space could never, ever be entered again. But what about the victims? After all of this, what happened to them? Well, in a really remarkable display of strength, Elizabeth and her family put out this public message. After everything they had been through, they reached out to thank the community, focusing not on the darkness they escaped, but on the goodness they were finding in the world. So at the end of the day, what do we take away from this? A case like this, it pushes the boundaries of what we can even comprehend about human cruelty. But it also shows us the incredible resilience of the human spirit. And it forces us to ask some really tough questions, not just about evil, but about the systems we have in place, the social safety nets that are supposed to protect the most vulnerable people among us.